Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. In 1932, journalist John Pittman published in the radical black San Francisco newspaper called The Spokesman a piece called Prejudice Against Homosexuals. In it, he writes this, quote, "What Negroes and homosexuals both desire is to be regarded as human beings with the rights and liberties of human beings, including the right to be let alone, to enjoy life in the way most agreeable and pleasant, to live secure from interference and insult." I found this from the writings of Aaronlechlighter, a professor of American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And he joins me now to talk about his book called Love's Next Meeting, The Forgotten History of Homosexuality and the Left in American Culture. He joins us for a conversation about homosexuality and the left in the first half, really, of the 20th century. In other words, for Stonewall and even the so-called Lavender Scare. The history, as he says in his book, is largely forgotten. Aaronlechlighter, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me come in.
Tell me more about John Pittman. Who was John Pittman?
So John Pittman was a Black radical labor activist and journalist who was one of the two founders of this newspaper in the Bay Area called The Spokesman, which was a Black radical newspaper in the 1930s. He was himself really involved in the radical left and eventually became even more involved within the Communist Party. And he was really committed to connecting labor, race politics, and broader radical politics into one kind of stewy mix of journalism and activism. And the article that you mentioned here was one of his kind of typical op-eds that he wrote for every issue of The Spokesman, where he would take on a particular issue and he had a really bold position on things and was sort of unrelenting in his criticism. This was sort of unusual at the time for him, but also for even radical publications, because it was so directly talking about homosexuals in relation to prejudice. And so he was kind of repurposing the language that was a little bit more familiar in his other writings, more familiar to his readers, as being something that was applicable to the problems of racism, and sort of expanding that outward to also think about other folks who were confronting various forms of oppression. And he was certainly drawing on his own experience and history on the left, but he was also sort of pushing it into directions that were probably a little bit more explicit and bold, even for other folks in his cadre at the time.
Was he gay?
No, he wasn't. He was just somebody who was looking at the world around him and diagnosing and sort of what we might now call calling out various things that ended up on his radar. But he was not himself gay.
Which is significant, and also significant to the story, because in talking about the left and homosexuality in the first half of the 20th century, it's a story of both homophobia and acceptance, and participation.
I think that's right. And I think that sometimes it's hard to think about social movements that are speaking to a particular identity and imagining them as connected to a broader social movement that exists beyond and outside of that identity. And so folks like John Pittman were absolutely critical to raising issues that were not unique to people who themselves identified as gay, but putting it into some kind of context that could link it up with other social movements that maybe had a little broader base, that had been articulated and theorized a little bit more clearly. So, I think that his point of entry was not self-interest in any way, other than that he actually cared about living in a better world, and more about creating those kinds of links with other communities that he didn't necessarily belong to, but cared deeply about.
And again, The Spokesman is a radical black newspaper, so he's not writing for the masses necessarily. In his audience is more of a radical audience, and he's not necessarily, with this piece anyways, preaching to the choir.
No, I would say very much was not preaching to the choir with that piece. It was certainly coming out of a broader cultural context where there was space on the left to think about the kinds of things that he addressed in that particular article. But it was by no means something that was front and center, even on the left at the time. So the kind of boldness of that gesture and the care with which he sort of decided to frame this issue through other kinds of issues that were more familiar, that was both coming out of a broader movement, but also the kind of courage that I think was also a little bit exceptional even at the time.
Your book, Love's Next Meeting, begins in the 1920s. What's important to know about that time?
Well, in the 1920s, there was still a lot of energy on the left. A lot of the direction that took was looking to things like the Bolshevik Revolution that had sort of changed the shape of what leftists could look to as being a model society. It was before the Great Depression created this crisis in the U.S. until obviously the end of the 1920s. It was before that crisis kind of made the stakes even more existential for a lot of people. But it was also this time when there was a sort of newfound energy around imagining the U.S. as having something that was an alternative out there. So we don't, I think, typically think about the 1920s as a radical decade. It's oftentimes thought about
Roaring 20s.
Roaring 20s, yeah, exactly. Which had its own kind of radical gestures too. Obviously, there was a lot that was going on in terms of gender and women and whatnot. So it's not that it wasn't there, but I think that the broad characterization of it is a little bit more about the decadence, the expansion of wealth to folks at the top and whatnot, which was all true and is all happening. But it was also this moment where there was this newfound hope after 1919 that said, hey, we don't need to imagine this abstracted place where a revolution is possible. We can now look to a place where revolution has happened. And that became kind of a starting point for thinking about what the US might look like.
You write that in the book. Until 1924, the Communist Party was organized into underground cells where members remained invisible even to one another. This isn't so dissimilar to what was happening to gays and lesbians of the time. You also had to remain underground. But did that create some kind of shared space?
I would say that the shared spaces were a little bit more in everyday practices more than in organizational spaces. But in terms of everyday practice, exactly what you're saying is correct. These kinds of underground networks, people who are known to one another, but not necessarily to the public at large. The process of relating to the world in that way, I think, was kind of shared. And in some ways, I think that's why some of the impediments to joining up with a radical movement that confronted other constituencies within the United States maybe were a little bit less of an obstacle for gay leftists because they already had that skill behind them a little bit. They knew how to navigate through oppression, through secrecy, through being marked as deviant, which was something that was applied a little bit more emphatically to communists after the 1920s. But that kind of skill set of moving through society with this sense of oppression and visibility, but also knowing one another, I think that was sort of shared in a more vernacular way than in an organizational way.
Tell me about the publication, The New Masses.
So The New Masses was a magazine that was started in the 1920s. It had actually been a kind of reincarnation of a magazine called The Masses, which had appeared for a period in the earlier 20th century that kind of tried to bring together bohemian culture, socialism, art, culture, literature, all within the same magazine. And New Masses was a relaunch of that magazine, and it was a little bit heavier in its connections to the left. And by the end of the 20s into the 1930s, it became a de facto leftist cultural organ that ended up being edited in part by Mike Gold, who was one of the important communist writers of the Depression era. But it was a magazine that was thinking about leftist issues, but largely thinking about them through culture. So rather than reporting specifically on actions and labor strikes, though that was all there, it was also engaging with novels, with plays, with art, and so on. So it was a little bit more of a cultural magazine than a political magazine, but the politics infused every dimension of it.
And what role does it play in the story about the gay community and the left in this period of time?
So one of the things that became clear to me as I began researching this book was how much more space there was for thinking capaciously about sexuality through culture than through what we might call traditional organizational channels. And that's not to say they weren't there. There were all kinds of instances when labor unions and parties took up the issue of sexuality. But among artists and writers and playwrights and performers, the space for thinking creatively seemed to open up a broader way of thinking about sexuality and politics as connected. So because New Masses was already entering into people's homes with the lens of culture as being political in place, it became a site for exploring, working out, trying to make sense of sexuality and the left in a way that was a little bit more open, a little bit more creative, a little bit more complicated than what one might find in other kind of venues.
And was it challenging the prevailing thoughts about homosexuality within the left of the time?
I think it was, but it sort of depends where you look. So certainly there was a lot of reticence within the Communist Party, for example, about taking a particularly bold position on homosexuality specifically, but even sex more generally, both because of the general sense that the big battle that had to be won was class-based and could be a little bit reductive in that regard, but also because there was a lot of concern about something like a kind of moral propriety to insulate members from the kind of onslaught of attacks that could come their direction if they were in any way challenging other kinds of social norms. So there was a kind of, I don't want to call it a myopia because I actually think it was not totalizing in that regard, but it was a sort of general undercurrent that existed. Within the world of culture, there was just a sort of different way of thinking about those issues. There was a different way of thinking about creative expression, for example, and sex in some ways can be thought about as a form of creative expression. So I think that there was a latitude both given to artists and writers to kind of push the boundaries of what could be considered political. And there was also a kind of latitude that was given to the kind of expressive work, if it was a little bit more abstracted in some ways. Things like poetry didn't have to necessarily give a directive. It could be thinking things through in a nuanced and subtle way. That kind of vocabulary also lent itself to thinking about sexuality in ways that were a little bit less, I don't like words like dogmatic, but I'm just going to use it here as a shorthand. A little bit less dogmatic than somebody setting a policy position or writing a policy paper that was really designed purely to set up a new program of action.
You write about a piece that was published in the New Masses in 1929 by somebody who just went by the initials of HHC, who for a very long time, even with the publication of the book, your book, still didn't know who that person was. Eventually, you would learn who that person was after the publication of your book. But before we get into who that person actually was, it was still an important piece just from this person who was known only by these initials, HHC. Tell me about that piece.
Yeah, that was actually one of the earliest things that I found that drove me to think about this project as potentially being a book. This was a letter that this individual wrote into the magazine New Masses, describing his experiences as a working class person who was experiencing some kind of same-sex desire, and the experience that he articulated was a little bit poetic, but also very articulate in clearly stating that reading New Masses was the place where he was finding the strength to become himself. And that kind of language was really not common at that time. The language of kind of becoming true to yourself, and then also seeing the left as a space where that was a place of possibility. This was sort of not the kind of way that sex and sexuality was being talked about at this moment, but it's something that's a little bit more familiar now. So I was really interested in this sort of what felt like it was a little anachronistic. And he was pretty explicit about it. So that was published in a section called Workers' Letters, where people would typically write in and talk about their jobs so that readers could know, okay, this is what happens in the life of a taxi driver. I think that that was actually the other letter that was in the same in that same issue. So this was a little bit off that script. But it fit in somehow and it made sense somehow. And the editors made the choice to publish that. So it just suggested this whole constellation of possibility. And then 2 issues later in the same magazine, they posted a notice saying the editors had received a lot of letters directed to this letter writer, directed to HHC. And that suggested even more to me that that meant that readers were reading that letter and saying, I want to reach out to this person. So there was this kind of broad network of people that were responding to the experiences he was describing. And the editor said, if you send us your name and address, we'll forward them on to you. That was where the story ended, and it had both this sense of hope when I encountered it, but also this sense of heartbreak, because of course there was a space where this could be said, this could be written about, this could be published, but it still had that veil of invisibility, that anonymity, that was this layer of protection that other folks that would write in about, being a taxi driver didn't have to, make their name anonymous. So it spoke to both that pull of possibility of hope, but also the kind of day-to-day struggles that folks encountered, sexual dissidents, especially at that time.
And this anonymity and just sort of trying to hide is very important thread in the story you tell.
Yeah, I think that it's hard to tell a clean, neat narrative that says there was this liberation that happened in the period in the early 20th century around homosexuality, because of course it was still existing within a social structure that was not particularly built for liberation. And it wasn't built for liberation for all kinds of different people who were marginalized in American society. And there was a particular kind of, I think, protection that queer people, for lack of a better term, were experiencing at this time, or needed at this time, that while the left represented a space that could potentially offer some kind of pathway to liberation, it was in the future. It wasn't there yet. So there was a constant navigation, I think, for folks as to how to negotiate those different positions.
After the publication of your book, again, you actually did find the identity of HHC, Alan Campbell.
Yes, this was a sort of remarkable discovery that was really not even my own. It was a scholar in Ireland named Maurice Casey, and he came across a letter written to Havelock Ellis, who was a sexologist and a socialist, and in the letter to Ellis, this individual, Alan Campbell, talked about having published a letter in New Masses in the same issue, and it became very clear. And he was writing to Ellis as a gay person, like that was the point. It became very clear that this was the same person, and he actually mentioned that after the letter was published in New Masses, he received correspondence, which also told me that, in fact, the editors had gotten his identity and had forwarded them on to them. And in fact, even met up with somebody for a brief period and referred to it. I can't remember the exact phrasing off the top of my head, but something like the love, the greatest love he'd ever experienced, something like that. It was very brief, but he did actually meet up with this guy. And so that also suggested that there was this after story that's almost impossible to access when you're talking about people from the past who have been made invisible. So the scholar found this letter, reached out to me. There was another piece of the after story is that he managed to publish a novel even after that, and it was a very kind of queer novel, maybe a little bit less explicitly leftist, but there was this whole after story, and that was something I never imagined that there was any way that I would ever have access to that. So that was it was a real act of generosity by Dr. Casey to point me in that direction.
Were you able to find any, other than the novel, any of Alan Campbell's writings or of these letters that were sent to him?
I haven't at this point. This just happened a couple months ago, and it seems like the correspondence. He doesn't have an archive, so the correspondence would just be people that he wrote to, and I haven't found other instances of that. But I certainly have been trying a little bit to find what's here and there. It's you're always kind of subjected to what libraries, archivists, there's such a whole institutional network of who decides what gets preserved, and resources are limited. We can't preserve every human's letters. So Alan Campbell in some ways is sort of a minor figure in literature. He published one novel, so his papers aren't collected. But the more people we have on the scent, the more likely it is that somebody's going to find a letter written to somebody else. If he's writing to Havelock Ellis, he might be writing to other sexologists, and eventually maybe we'll develop a fuller picture of him and his life. And I would love to see those letters. The letters. I wanted to find the letters written to New Masses, but I wasn't able to locate those either. But that might also be because they forwarded them.
Right.
They were by that point in his possession. But that would be a fascinating thing to come across as well.
Literature is an important part of your research in telling this story.
Yeah, I am always interested in literature, just as a kind of personal interest. But I also think that literature is important to social movements. And I think that it sometimes gets discounted in some respects as being less of a serious archive. If you have a novel that is doing political work or describing experiences, because it is fiction as a genre, it doesn't seem quite as authoritative as something like a party record. And yet the lived experiences of people who participate in political movements, they're mediated through this. And especially in the Depression era, there was a pretty explicit push to think about how literature could be very instrumental to building radical social movements. So I came into this project with the conviction that if we wanted to tell this story, it required taking literature seriously and taking art seriously, because that was the space, going back to something we were talking about earlier, that was the space that had the capacious creative possibilities, where things that were very present in the minds of people could be given voice, could be circulated, could be entering into the broader discourse. So I was interested both in the literature itself and the folks that chose to write the books and the stories that I talk about, because they also were activists and they were seeing their literature as part of their activism. So, ignore that at your peril. I think it's an important part of the archive, and if you ignore it, you really can't tell the story.
Highlight for me a couple of these authors and their books and the importance in understanding homosexuality in the left in the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah, so I would say one of the people who was most important to me in developing this project was a Chinese American writer named H.T. Tsang, who wrote a book in 1935, a novel called The Hanging in Union Square. It wasn't his first novel, but it was arguably his most explicitly radical novel. The character essentially starts out destitute, trying to find a place to sleep, trying to find food to eat, and ends up at the end of it aligned with the Communist Party. So it is a kind of classic proletarian novel narrative. But along the way, the character's radicalization happens through all these weird, intimate, same-sex experiences that he has with other men, also encountering gender variant people. There's a character named Miss Stubborn who is a kind of butch woman. And there's all these queer characters that populate the novel, and that's kind of what pushes him into a more radical position, is encountering people who are living outside the mainstream of society, who are just not following the norms, and that frees him in some ways to pursue a more radical political position. It's also a hilarious novel. We oftentimes think about maybe humor and camp as being something that is emblematic
Found in the
of.
Communist Party.
It's not what we think of as a communist party, but in this novel, it's hilarious. And it struck me, like, why don't we talk about this, the humor and the levity of this, and I think it was connected in some ways to the fact that it is such a queer novel. And I've been writing about that novel for a long time, even before this book came out, and sort of been proselytizing on it. But I think that it's emblematic in that regard, that it goes through this kind of urban landscape and represents this transition from somebody who's maybe even a little reactionary, encounters all these queer people, and ends up as a revolutionary. And it's also just a delight to read. So that's one of the novels I spent a lot of time.
Do you think there's a genre? Do you think there's a genre of this kind of literature?
I would say that particular form, Tsang was an incredibly experimental writer, and he really didn't follow the rules. So even as a proletarian novelist, even though he was committed to writing a novel that was revolutionary, he was so singular. He published the novel himself. He couldn't find a publisher to take it on, and so he hand sold it in the street. He was a bit of a performer, so he turned it into a one-man show and performed it, and claimed that Orson Welles and Rita Hayworth came to the performances. He said, you never know what's exactly true. But I think he was a little bit of a singular figure. But the themes that come up in his work, the relationship between poverty, sexuality, revolution, I think that those themes were coursing through, I would venture to say, the majority of proletarian novels. And there's this common misconception that when homosexuality appears in radical fiction, it's to demonstrate the decadence of the bourgeoisie. But when you actually read these novels, it's everywhere, and that's really less often its function. There's all kinds of novels where characters are radicalized through sexuality, or sexuality becomes something of a vehicle for a broader based politics, and sometimes it's just background noise. One of the first novel, actually the first novel that was written, at least in the US, that specifically named Hitler, in 1934 it was published, and was really about a building anti-fascist movement, has a character who's radicalized because another character who's explicitly marked as queer by carrying a Havelock Ellis book, and there were other signifiers. But the main character in the novel is radicalized when he discovers that that person wants him. And there's a passage where the writer Edward Dahlberg says something about how he had never felt wanted like that before, and that was such a gift that it makes him want to join with this broad anti-fascist movement. And that is very far from this idea of sexuality as being something decadent, something that is reserved for a kind of bourgeois extra credit activity or something, extracurricular activity. It's fully integrated into the pathway to revolution, and that shows up pretty regularly in leftist literature.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Aaronlechlighter. Aaronlechlighter is a professor of American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and he joins us for a conversation about his book called Love's Next Meeting, The Forgotten History of Homosexuality and the Left in American Culture. It has just come out in paperback. Who was Betty Millard?
Betty Millard is another, I say this about everybody in the book, but another one of my favorite folks that I came across in this book. She was a communist and a feminist who wrote several sort of pamphlets about trying to connect gender politics and class politics in the Depression era and thereafter. And she was also one of the editors of the New Masses, which we talked about earlier. So she was really involved in the left. She was really involved in trying to think critically about how women were both central to and sometimes excluded from the left. And she was also a lesbian, and she came out somewhat later in life. She left a diary from the 1930s, which is housed in an archive, and talked pretty explicitly about how her politics were shaped by her sexual identity, her sexual desires. And she left a pretty clear record of that. There were excisions from it, but she left a pretty clear trail connecting those themes.
Incisions in it. This is not insignificant. She literally cut out portions of her diary.
Yeah, and this is one of these moments again where both the courage and heartbreak of this past becomes so palpable and so real. When she got to certain points in her diary where she was talking about things that were either maybe dangerously radical or dangerously sexual, she cut them out. And when you look at the diary, they weren't just crossed out, which you saw a lot in diaries and journals and whatnot. She actually took some kind of X-Acto knife type thing and sliced out pieces of the page. That felt really meaningful to me because it suggested both that she understood the danger of leaving this record. She understood that this could be something that harmed her, but also the courage of deciding to keep it anyway and to keep the parts that that might be an important record for folks like myself to be able to access, to be able to tell these kinds of stories and her stories specifically. So I think that gesture, I mean, it's a little violent. It leaves no possibility of undoing. Even crossing something out, sometimes you can, and I did this in archives, you hold the letter up to the light and you can kind of see what's behind it. That possibility wasn't there. And that suggests that she was well aware of how her position in American society put her at risk. But she also recognized the importance of her position in American society and let us have access to most of that.
Tell me about that position in American society.
Well, I think that she was somebody who was struggling because she wanted to make the Communist Party and make the left better. And so she was working at New Masses, and she was at one point the only woman on the mastheads. They had all these editors, and she was bold. She would send letters just excoriating the other male editors for excluding women from the conversations or treating what was commonly called at the time the woman question as being ancillary to the primary concerns that the party folks and the New Masses editors were thinking about. And she pushed against that, and she wrote really spiritedly about women and about women in relation to class. And in that regard, I think that she was an important figure. And by the way, the historian Bettina Apteker has written a book where she gets a little bit more into the biography and the life of Betty Millard, and that's also worth dipping into for anybody listening who becomes interested in her. But this was again, it was coming out of a movement. It was not I don't want to suggest that she was existing apart from the movement that she was part of, because I don't think she saw herself that way. She saw herself within the party trying to make a difference. But she was also really drawing on her own experiences, and I think her own desires and whatnot, in order to make that better, in order to come up with an even better vision for what a more just society might look like.
I do want to talk specifically about the homophobia found within the left in the first half of the 20th century and ask you about one figure who I think is important actually to talk about, and that's Upton Sinclair. Most of us know Upton Sinclair because we read the book, The Jungle, a very important book. I read it in high school. Also, not as well remembered, but equally as important, his run for governor of California, part of the EPIC campaign to end poverty in California in the 1930s, oftentimes been lionized by the left for that run. But it was through your book that I learned that he was also somebody who was quite homophobic.
Yeah, Upton Sinclair, I think, was a little bit old school by the time we get to the 1930s, when a lot of my book is taking place. And he was a bit of a renegade. He was always a bit of a renegade. And so I think he took a little bit of delight in being a little bit prudish sexually, and he would make sport of it a little bit. But he really did believe, I think, that if you wanted to fight for revolution, you had to put everything else aside. And sex for him, I think, was something that was just a little frivolous. It wasn't the point of the revolution. And, he was a little bit moralistic, but he was moralistic because he wanted more justice. He wasn't coming at it from a sense of using morality to make people get in line. I think he really thought that that was part of his mission for justice. But I would say he overshot the target a little bit. There were other voices on the left that would have debates with him. There were a couple of forums where Upton Sinclair was pitted against somebody like, I think Floyd Dell, maybe, just going back and forth about what the proper leftist position on sex and sexuality was. But then there was also this instance where he essentially was so appalled by Eisenstein, the Soviet filmmaker who was gay.
Eisenstein.
What's that?
Yes, Eisenstein.
Yeah. He was so appalled by his behavior on the set of the Western that Eisenstein tried to make that he essentially threatened to out him, to tell people about his homosexuality, which could have landed him in a little bit of hot water. So that was maybe not Sinclair's proudest moment, looking backwards.
I characterized him as homophobic. Do you think that was fair?
Yeah, I do, but I also think that it's complicated, because at the time, I think that was just kind of what society was. It was antipathy towards homosexuality was ingrained so deeply. It wasn't exceptional on the left, but there's something a little bit disappointing when you encounter a social movement that's working so hard to make a better, more just world, and then is replicating some of the things that was some of the features of dominant society that a revolution would ideally eradicate. The language of homophobia I find to be maybe a little bit more useful in the present context, when you have an alternative and you have a little bit more visibility. But yeah, I certainly think that, looking back at Upton Sinclair, it's hard to imagine him as something other than somebody who had a certain distaste for homosexuality.
Were people ever run out of the Communist Party or any leftist organizations in this period of time because of their sexuality?
Yes, though I didn't have access to the Communist Party's records to detail the disciplinary actions. But there was a point in 1938 when the Communist Party laid down a firmer line, and it was, as things were really heating up with the anti-fascist movement becoming even more central to what the Communist Party was doing. And they said, look, we're going to fail if we have anything that deviates from normal behavior. And so they started to crack down a little bit. The number of folks that got caught up in that dragnet is unclear. Harry Hayes, probably because he went on to form Madison, the gay rights organization in the 1950s. He was somebody that was part of the party and openly gay, and they didn't want to get rid of him. He actually had to ask to be removed from the party because they didn't want to get rid of him. So exactly how extensive the implementation was is sort of harder to access. Certainly by the time you get to the 1950s, it's pretty open and it's pretty explicit, and there's a lot that we can know about that. But in a lot of the time that I'm talking about, it's not clear how much it was applied on the ground, but it certainly was official within the documents.
The rise of fascism is important because that would bring sort of a dynamic change to the left. So, in a way that kind of reminds me, obviously many differences too, but in some ways reminds me of the left and what's happening within the left today after the rise of Donald Trump to the presidency. But with the rise of fascism in the 1930s, you end up having radicals starting to align themselves with liberals in order to oppose fascism because of the threat of fascism.
Yeah, it's this really critical turning point, and I think that it is complicated, and it is, the resonances I think are probably familiar to contemporary listeners at this point and readers. But two things are happening at once when you have this very deep existential threat. One is that it's taking resources and energy away from other struggles. So when there's this huge thing happening, that takes a lot of the energy out of the things that feel like they can wait, And so I think that with the anti-fascist movement and the Popular Front, and I don't really come down on one line or the other about whether the Popular Front was good or bad. I know a lot of scholars of the left have a lot of debates about that. I'll leave that to them. But I certainly think it shifts things because it does introduce this vocabulary where an alignment of far left radicals with sort of centrist liberals, it becomes something that's imagined as possible. Whether people take that up or not is more individualized, and it depends on the party, it depends on the individual, it depends on all kinds of different factors. So whether it actually is implemented is one thing, but the fact that that's seen as a possibility, that one can still hang on to a leftist orientation and align with sort of centrist or even New Deal style democratic principles, that creates a new kind of possibility that in some ways creates space for the left to move into the mainstream. And that can be a very seductive thing. That can be a very appealing thing to folks who are tired of being pushed to the margins or see that as a pathway to victory. Either way, you end up with this possibility that maybe before wasn't there. With respect to homosexuality, one of the things that became clear to me in my research was a lot of queer people were drawn towards the Communist Party in part because they didn't like the society around them. They were already marked as deviant. So what was the obstacle to joining with the left? Once the left becomes something that is indistinguishable in some ways from the middle, that becomes something that doesn't have as much space for deviance, and the possibility of thinking about political deviance and sexual deviance as being aligned, that becomes less, I think, as of a motivating factor. So the anti-fascist movement, also introduces, language of freedom, language of democracy, and all of these things that had been really not central to what the left, just the way they were talking about revolution and talking about class and talking about race and whatnot prior to that moment. And I think that extends to sexuality as well.
And then there's a moment in which the gay movement, and there's no just one movement, but in some, earlier I asked about how communists and leftists would push gays and lesbians out of their organizations. But there's a moment then with the rise, with the Red Scare, the rise of McCarthyism, and the gay movement then would leave the communists and try to separate themselves from the communists. And you write about this, and you mentioned earlier, Madison. What was Madison?
So Madison was one of the first openly gay rights oriented organizations. It formed in the early 1950s. Harry Hay was one of the founders. There was actually
Former
five
communist.
members. Yeah. So Harry Hay had been a member of the Communist Party, as had all the other folks that were the founding members of Madison. There were five of them. They were based in Los Angeles. And the organization was really, to my mind, a kind of popular front organization when it founded. It used principles of the left. It even used some of the organizational strategies of the older Communist Party, such as the cells that we talked about earlier, that structure to maintain connection, but also reduce risk. It borrowed from a lot of that. And it was, broadly part of what we talk about as the homophile movement, this movement that was really kind of rights oriented, used language of citizenship and whatnot. But in its earliest iteration, when it first formed, Madison was coming out of the left. But as it got traction, as it became more visible, there was a pretty significant contingent within the Madison that saw the relationship to the Communist Party among its founding members as a liability. And because the organization had been really founded on this idea that you can get access to rights, and in some ways, it was for the first time breaking off from broader leftist social movements and isolating sexuality as being the only kind of issue of concern. It became possible to just imagine the organization as being a little bit more traditionally patriotic, And so there was a movement to excise and to get rid of anybody who had any kind of history within the Communist Party, and that included the founders, who were, really broken by that.
Founders of Madison.
Yeah, it was really heartbreaking, I think, for the folks that were part of this movement, that had built this movement, and who saw it in some ways as an extension of a lifelong commitment to radicalism and revolution, to suddenly be excised from the organization that they had founded, and to see it move in this direction that was much more about assimilating into American norms, performing good citizenship and whatnot. It was really heartbreaking. One of the founders ended up committing suicide. Another member ended up burning all the documents. There was infighting. There was just a lot of real heartbreak around that. And I think that it hurt the organization too, because they didn't have that kind of energy anymore. And so I don't know. There's been a kind of cultural reevaluation of the homophile movement in Madison. But in order to kind of resuscitate it as being a precursor to the successful gay rights movements that come later, you have to ignore that. You have to ignore the way that they became something of, henchmen for the state, just replicating the exact kind of oppression of communists that the state was enacting at the time in the McCarthy era as well. And you also have to see this kind of separating off sexuality as being the center of a political struggle that's not connected to other dispossessed people, other marginalized people, that can be talked about without talking about race, without talking about gender, without talking about class. That's also the legacy of Madison, is separating itself off from broader revolutionary social movements.
Sort of a transition in a movement that would, with time and decades later, bring the right to marry and to join the military, which, radical gay and lesbians and transgender folks wasn't necessarily high on their agenda.
No, I don't think it was. Yeah, I don't think it was. But I think that, for me, the interesting thing about the left is that you can see how it emerges in different kind of forms, and some of them are obvious. Like, nobody's going to question whether there's a history within something like the DSA to earlier leftist movements, whether the old left or the new left. But for me, organizations like Black Lives Matter, which is a completely queer-run organization, queer leadership, really incorporating queer politics into this radical position that has a very strong dimension of class liberation as being an essential part of race liberation and Black liberation specifically. That to me is a more interesting lineage. If you isolate sexuality from other kinds of social issues, it's sort of inevitable in some ways that you end up with things that are rights extended just to a particular group. But if you see it as part of a connection to working class people, poor people, Black people, immigrants, women, and whatnot, then you can kind of draw a different lineage where you don't end with that. You end up with something like Black Lives Matter, which is a completely influential, successful liberationist movement.
And it harkens back to what you saw in the first half of the 20th century.
It does to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the jump from John Pittman to Black Lives Matter is not incidental to me. It's folks who are looking at the world and looking at the possibilities of liberation and thinking about that as being something that requires solidarity between various kinds of dispossessed people and trying to make that the center, the broader liberation of as many folks as possible. That to me is a linkage between then and now, but I don't see that linkage as much in something like the same-sex marriage push. Much as I certainly think like you shouldn't deny folks access to institutions. Where the center is, I think, is I see the lineage much more between those kinds of movements than I do between the old left and kind of the. I don't know. I don't want to get in trouble, but some of the newer gay organizations.
I'll stop it here to save you from going any further. Aaronlechlighter has been our guest. Again, Aaronlechlighter is a professor of American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and he is the author of the book that he's joined us to talk about. It's called Love's Next Meeting, The Forgotten History of Homosexuality and the Left in American Culture. It's now out in paperback. Aaronlechlighter, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I have as well.